So Malenia, definitely one of the more challenging boss fights in the entire game, and she actually does work very differently compared to a lot of the other bosses too. Whether it be her aggressive input reading, the hyper armor dodges, the health regen, the fact that she can get staggered and stun locked pretty nicely. And typically she actually is a pretty passive boss when you are sitting at a distance, so there will be plenty of different particular types of weapons that actually might perform nicely against Malenia, but probably not so much the other bosses in this game. So that's what this video is going to be about. We're just going to go over the 10 best ways to kill Malenia, which is basically going to be like just 10 cheese builds. We're just here to just break her entirely. So if you clicked on this video looking for like 10 fun ways to fight Malenia, this ain't it. We're just here to cheese her, which honestly, some people actually do find that fun. Even myself. I'll do random challenge runs, no hit runs, level 1 runs, but sometimes I just like to just make a broken ass build and just cheese a bunch of bosses. So don't be coming into the comment section and be like,
How could people enjoy this type of playstyle? This is so boring.
People consume video games in different ways, just let them be. Now, one thing that I do want to mention that is going to be consistent throughout all of these builds is that if you are struggling against waterfowl dance, just use freezing pots. Every single time you see her jump in the air, and if you don't know how to dodge that attack, just throw a freezing pot at her, it'll instantly proc frost, and when proccing things like bleed or frost, it's going to cancel any type of animation that she's in. Doesn't matter if she has hyper armor or extended poise at all, it's just going to stagger her out of it. Now, unfortunately, you can't really just buy these things, you're going to have to farm a bunch of materials to try and craft them. But if you are having problems with that attack in particular, this is definitely an item that you do want to pick up. There are plenty of really great strength-based options to use against Malenia, and for this number 10 spot, I was kind of picking between either the Great Stars or the Guts' Greatsword, and I ended up going with the Great Stars in this instance. The Guts' Greatsword with Giant Hunts makes for an amazing build. You can just constantly stun lock her over and over again, but it does require pretty precise timing, and if you just miss it by like a few frames, you're not going to really get that infinite stun lock, where something like Great Stars with Stormcaller is probably not going to do as much damage, but it is going to be very easy to use. Now, the Great Stars is going to be one of the best Great Hammers in the game. Obviously gets that really good stance damage, nice range, good base damage, but it also does get bleed and health regen for every single hit. So pairing this alongside Stormcaller is not only going to give you some nice health regen, but it is going to proc bleed pretty quickly too. Now, going with a fire-based infusion is going to be perfectly fine because she obviously is weaker to fire damage. And being that fire infusions do scale of strength, it just makes sense. But being that this weapon actually does get passive bleed, pairing this alongside Blood Flame Blade can just make her bleed out very quickly because she also is weaker to bleed too. And being that you are going with a strength-based build, you might as well throw on the Claw Mark Seal, have a little bit of faith, and you could use some fire-based incantations, which is not going to be doing like the most amazing amount of damage. But in those certain instances where she uses Scarlet Aeonia, you actually can hit her with a projectile while she's in that animation. Being that Malenia is weaker to things like bleed and fire damage, obviously the Rivers of Blood and the Eleanor's Pole Blade are just going to make for amazing options. Both of these things do get roughly 50% fire damage and just get a decent amount of blood loss build up. And both of the skills of these weapons can actually work very nicely against Malenia. With Rivers of Blood, Corpse Piler actually does stun lock her. Now yes, something like the Nugget Kiba with Double Slash can actually work better because at point blank range it actually can do more damage. You could potentially do more blood loss build up as well. But one benefit that Corpse Piler actually does have is that projectile part. That bleed projectile ends up extending the weapon's range by like 2 or 3 times the amount. Now that projectile is obviously not going to do anywhere near as much damage as hitting at point blank range. But the thing is with Malenia, she actually isn't really that aggressive with you when you're at these further distances. And the Rivers of Blood actually gets the perfect range to where you can sit at a safe distance and hit her with the projectile part of Corpse Piler. And it is like a projectile that she doesn't actually input read. She actually won't dodge it. Now the Eleanor's Pole Blade is going to work very similar. The damage output is not going to be as much as the Rivers of Blood, nor is it probably going to be as easy because it does require you to be at point blank range. But the stun lock potential is definitely higher, and it does do a lot of stance damage. The entire combo can just do upwards of 60 stance damage, which Malenia has 80 poise. So if you just hit her with a couple of light attacks and then hit her with a full combo with the weapon skill, it's just going to poise break her every time. Now it can be pretty inconsistent with the hit detection. She might just straight up like dodge it and you're just going to miss completely. And you're going to get stuck in a longer animation of which you can get punished. So it's probably not going to be the easiest thing to use, but both of these weapons are definitely going to cheese her. And being that you're actually speccing into an arcane build, you might as well go ahead and use some spells with the Dragon Communion Seal. The Dragon spells are obviously going to work amazingly here. Do you see something like Argahil's Flame or Dragonfire, which actually does use Scarlet Aeonia? After you dodge it, you can just use this projectile and it'll do a nice amount of damage. Now, obviously, Malenia being weaker to fire damage, there are plenty of options of which we can use, whether it be weapons or spells, and I think the Magma Curve Sword is going to be one of them. The weapon skill of the Magma Sword is going to be like a reskinned version of Spinning Slash, actually does stagger enemies pretty nicely. The stance damage can be somewhat high, but the benefit of this is it actually does leave a bunch of lava on the ground, and when she's standing inside of it, she'll just end up taking a lot of damage. Now, being that we are going to go with a Faith type of build, obviously might as well use some spells. Some of the best fire spells to use will be something like Burn O Flame. It is pretty RNG heavy, sometimes you'll use it and just miss with like most of the pillars. But if the RNG is correct, she can get like yeeted up into the air and constantly stun locked and get hit with every single one of those pillars that will just do amazing damage. If you have it fully charged alongside the Godfrey's icon, it could do amazing damage, but even if you just use it uncharged, just to have her staggered and get hit by one of the pillars, by the time she stands up, you can just go ahead and use your weapon skill, and it can make for an amazing combo that way. Some other spells to use would be something like Flamefall upon them. This spell has a very nice horizontal spread. She will actually attempt to dodge it, but being that it actually spreads out pretty far, she actually still will end up getting hit by it, which also Scouring Black Flame does work very similar as well. Morgoth's Curse Sword is an amazing weapon to use against enemies that can get staggered, which Malenia is obviously going to fall under that category, and it is just going to proc bleed very quickly because the weapon skill, Curse Blood Slice for 20 FP, does a really nice lunging animation. It also does leave a little bit of like a fire lingering effect. So if she actually does attempt to dodge it, by the time she finishes the dodge, she probably end up getting hit by the fire, then you actually basically get a guaranteed follow-up, which the entire combo can output a lot of damage and really high blood loss build-up. You can just constantly spam this skill over and over again, and you could just also do very nice stance damage. And if you end up proccing the stance break, this weapon actually does get 110 crit, so even your opposed will just end up doing bonus damage. The weapon itself is just amazing because it actually does have the most range in class, and it also is the lightest. Now, some downsides that I could say about this is obviously the skill can be pretty high for 40 FP with the entire combo, and it also doesn't have that high of an arcane scaling. It definitely scales much better off dexterity, so if you actually did want to pair it alongside some dragon communion spells, if you have lower arcane, it's not going to really be doing much damage. The Coated Sword is definitely one of the more underrated weapons in the entire game, and it definitely is a very solid option against Malenia. Now, this weapon, yes, is doing holy damage, and she actually is somewhat resist to holy damage at 40%, but it still can make very quick work of her, because the weapon itself does have a pure faith scaling, doesn't get any split damage, so the damage itself can actually be pretty high, and when going into faith, you can pair it alongside things like Hellish Brewery. But the reason as to why this weapon in particular is really good against Malenia is because the weapon skill actually does extend the length of the weapon by so much that sitting at those longer distances, you can just get those attacks off for free because you actually won't even try to dodge it or move at all. And the fact that it has such a nice horizontal spread means that even if she did try to dodge it, she'll still end up getting hit by it. And it does 35 stance damage, which means that you only have to hit her 3 times and it's going to proc a stance break every single time. And for only 18 FP, you can't really go wrong. Now, being that this is actually a faith-based weapon with a pure faith scaling, you're going to build around it by just going all into faith, of which obviously you can benefit of using some pyromancies. Now, I'm going to recommend the exact same ones of which I talked about with the Magma Curve Sword. Burn O Flame, Flamefall upon them, Scouring Black Flame, all these work perfectly fine. But even just spamming the skill is going to make for a perfectly fine strategy, because in this fight, obviously you want to be able to use Frost Pot if you're struggling to dodge Waterfowl Dance. And when you proc Frost, for the next 20 seconds, you just end up doing 20% more damage. But if you hit her with fire damage, it actually ends up resetting and removing that debuff. So if you want to maximize your damage, using the holy damage by itself is actually going to be pretty good. The Sword of Knights and Flame is one of the best weapons in the entire game, period, because it has such great versatility with different damaging types, and it just gets ridiculous amounts of damage with not even having to have much stat investment. And it's just going to be a really good weapon to use against Malenia as well. Now, obviously, we're just going to be using the fire portion of this skill because she's really weak to fire damage. And it actually does get a very nice horizontal spread, of which every single time that she attempts to dodge it, she's still going to get hit by it, and it's going to be doing colossal damage. Now, when you're using the Sword of Night and Flame, I recommend just speccing both into Intelligence and Faith equally, because you want to be able to use both the magic and the fire-based version, depending on which boss that you are fighting. But once you end up going to a particular boss that's weak to a particular element, like in this instance, Malenia, you just want to stack up on all your fire-based buffs. So have the Faith tier on, the Fire tier, Fire Scorpion Charm, Flame Grant Me Strength, and you'll just end up melting her that way. Like, I don't even have much faith in the gameplay that you're seeing right now. I think I have about 40 intelligence and faith. I could have easily just put all of those points into faith instead, and I could be doing way more damage. But just to show you guys that you actually can do amazing damage without having to optimize it into a particular type of element is obviously going to be pretty cool. Now, being that you actually are spec'd into some faith, you can go ahead and use some spells, but I wouldn't really recommend it because your weapon skill is probably still going to be doing more damage and probably go far enough to hit her at those longer distances anyway. It is going to be pretty expensive at 30 FP, but pairing it alongside the Carrion Filigid Crest can make it very easy to spam. The Blasphemous Blade is one of the best weapons in the entire game, and the fact that it gets fire damage, health regen, and send smaller enemies flying when they do get hit by the skill, it's going to be no secret that is going to be one of the best options to use against Malenia. Basically, the entire build is going to involve around just spamming the skill. Now, unfortunately, it actually does travel in one straight line, and she does input, read, and dodge. So if you keep spamming it, she's probably just going to keep dodging it. But if you just do have one opening where you can use the skill after you bait out certain types of attacks, you can just infinitely stun lock her, because every single hit will knock her to the ground. And by the time that she stands back up, the next skill is coming right at her face. And then she's going to get knocked down to the ground again, and you can just keep stun locking her that way, all while getting a bunch of health regen and doing a nice amount of stance damage too. Now, once again, you will be using a faith type of build when spec'd into the Blasphemous Blade. So you can use some spells, of which the same ones that I recommended in the previous entries are probably still going to be in play. Things like Burno Flame, Flamefall Upon Them, some of the Black Flame spells. But the weapon skill Taker's Flame is plenty fine. The Ordovus' Greatsword is going to be one of the funniest weapons to use against Malenia, because this weapon's skill, Ordovus' Vortex, for only 15 FP, you do this really high damaging AoE attack that actually does get a nice amount of hype armor throughout the animation, but when you have it fully charged, it just hits multiple times, flattens her to the ground, and does upwards of 65 stance damage. And being that she has 80 poise in total, all you're going to do is hit her like once or twice afterwards, and then it could just result in a poise break. And being that she's actually flattened to the ground after doing a fully charged attack, you can just use an uncharged version of the skill as she's standing back up, and depending on what attack that she actually does do, that attack will just poise break her. And you can just honestly script the entire fight like this. Because after you poise break her, you go get the Riposte, of which I recommend pairing this build alongside the Dagger Talisman to just get even more critical damage. And then after the Riposte, you actually just do the charged skill again, flattens her to the ground, and you just basically just rinse and repeat. Now, the most broken part about this build is that when you pair this alongside the Stone Barbed Cracks tier, the fully charged attack does upwards of 80 stance damage, meaning that it's going to poise break her in just one attack. So you just do one fully charged attack and it will just proc the stance break. Now, this buff does only last 30 seconds, so I recommend just using it for the second phase. After she does the Scarlet Aeonia attack, just use your buff, and then the entire second phase is basically just a scripted boss fight. Use a fully charged weapon skill, get the Riposte, fully charged weapon skill, get the Riposte, and when paired alongside things like the Shard of Alexander and the Godfrey's Icon, you're just going to be doing so much damage. But yeah, this weapon is amazing in general, and it's especially good against Malenia. Now, there might be some builds out there that are specifically good against Malenia, but might not be as good for the rest of the game. But there are also just builds out there that are just good at everything, of which power stancing curve swords and even power stancing twin blade jumping attack builds, these things are just going to fuck up everything. Now, when going up against Malenia, going with either like a fire or flame arts infused curve sword or twin blades, or going with a bleed based build is going to be equally as good. I think the best build to use it would be like a dual scavengers with an occult based infusion. Now, unfortunately, this is going to be more for New Game Plus because you can only get one scavengers per playthrough. But the reason as to why this is good is because you just only need to spec into the arcane stat, of which you can pair this alongside the Dragon Communion Seal and just use a bunch of really good dragon incantations. Things like Argahill's Flame or Dragonfire can just decimate Malenia. But if you aren't in New Game Plus, using something like Flame Arts or Fire Bandits curve swords or Blade based Bandits curve swords is still going to be really good. And also, as I mentioned, twin blades are going to be fine as well. Now, I think curve swords are just going to be better in general because the power stancing combos are just good throughout, the running attacks, the light attack combos, and the jumping attacks. Whereas for twin blades, I think the jumping attack is the only good one. The running and light attack combos are just not going to be that good. But obviously, when speccing into a jumping attack build, things like the Claw Talisman, the Raptor Blackfeather's chest piece, and obviously the multi-hit talismans alongside the Thorny Cracks tier. So when fighting Malenia, it has been established that she is weaker to fire damage, weaker to bleed, weaker to attacks that can stagger and stun lock her nicely. It also can be very easily countered by ranged based AoE attacks that are very hard to dodge, of which the Mohgwyns Sacred Spear weapon skill does basically all of that. Bloodboon Ritual for 20 FP does a fire based AoE attack that stun locks smaller enemies and does an absolute metric fuck ton of bleed buildup. Now, the casting animation is going to be somewhat long, but you get a nice amount of hype armor. You can just use it at any point in the fight. She'll just get stun locked a whole bunch. She'll try to like hype armor dodge her way out of the AoE, but being that things like bleed and frost, when they actually get procced, she's going to get staggered no matter what. So even if she actually tries to do like a hype armor dodge or a hype armor waterfowl dance, she's just going to get staggered right out of it. And as you can see in the gameplay, this thing is just going to just destroy her. This is by far the best weapon to use against Malenia. And even when you're not using the skill, the weapon itself is still pretty decent. It's a great spear, which gets some nice range. It's still going to be doing split fire damage. You get some nice stance damage in there as well. But in terms of building around this weapon, I always recommend just going into a bunch of arcane. Obviously have a little bit of strength just to get some nice amounts of physical damage. But being that your weapon skill is going to scale off that arcane stat, I recommend just going all into that. Going to be doing a bunch more fire damage. You can pair this alongside the Dragon Communion Seal, and going into more arcane is going to boost your spell damage in total, of which allows you to use the dragon-based spells, which these things are just also broken. So yeah, if you're ever having problems with Malenia, any single one of these builds that I recommended are going to be really good, but this one definitely does do it the best. Anyway, that is the video now completed. If you do have your own findings as to what worked against Malenia, and if there's any other like broken ass builds that I missed, just let us know down in the comments below and we can discuss it there. And also do like and subscribe because I do have a bunch more videos coming out along the way. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.